Okay, so let's look a little bit at Epicurean metaphysics, which is a dualistic metaphysics. So metaphysics, the general definition of metaphysics is the study and concern with the nature of things that exist. The essential question that metaphysicians ask is, what is the nature of reality? For the Epicureans, reality consists of two things: matter and void, empty space. Those are the only things that exist. And matter is of a very particular kind. Matter is made up of atoms, which are tiny bodies that have only the unchanging qualities of shape, size, and weight. Now, having said that, I just want you to keep in mind, because I'll get back to this later, but having given this definition that atoms have the unchanging qualities of shape, size, and weight, that is not exactly the way that Epicurus thought of atoms. And his definition, his approach to atoms was slightly different from this. However, I'm just giving a general definition here because that's the way most people think of atoms. But the Epicurean atoms are slightly different from this definition. So the atom concept, Epicurus inherited from the atomists Democritus and Leucippus, whom I already referenced. The word atom comes from the Greek word atomos, which means uncuttable. So for a very long time, there were lots of discussions, not just by Democritus and Leucippus and Epicurus and other philosophers, the question of the minimus, or the minimal. What is the minimal thing that we can sort of conceive of that it can exist? And there were different ideas as to what the minimus was, or what the minimal thing was. And this particular idea, the idea of the atom, was one such idea. So for the atomists, all matter is ultimately reducible to discrete small particles or atoms. And the Epicureans took up the atomist view. Now, just a point that bears mentioning, what is particularly interesting about the Epicureans is that their moral philosophy, their ethics, arises from their physics. So it's not a rational based ethical model. It's a model that comes from an empiricist approach to reality and their understanding of the way in which the very physics of reality works. And this is based, of course, as I said, on the atomist view. So the universe is dualistic. Dualism is at the heart of Epicureanism. It's made up of an infinite supply of atoms and an infinite amount of void. Okay, I want to underline the word infinite. You might ask yourself, maybe you're not asking yourself, but you might ask yourself, why would Epicurus say that there's an infinite amount of atoms and an infinite amount of void? Why couldn't he say that there's a finite amount of atoms and a finite amount of void? Well, There was a reason for that. And what I want to do is read a quick quotation by Epicurus, where he actually discusses the notion of infinite as being essential to his atomistic theory. And I'm reading this because I think it really highlights the importance of reasoning to the Epicureans. The Epicureans were not just about the physical body, although they were to some degree, but they were also about the mind. And so this is the way in which Epicurus explains why he talks about the infinite void and infinite amount of atoms. Moreover, the sum of things is unlimited both by reason of the multitude of the atoms and the extent of the void. For if the void were infinite and bodies were finite, the bodies would not have stayed anywhere, but would have been dispersed in their course through the infinite void. You can't have an infinite void and a finite amount of atoms, because that means that no bodies would ever come together, given that the atoms would disperse into the infinite void and would therefore be unable to unite into any kind of body. So they would have been dispersed in their course through the infinite void, not having any supports or counter checks to send them back on their upward rebound. Again, if the void were finite, the infinity of bodies would not have anywhere to be. So if the void were finite, then all we would have would be a blob of atoms, and there would only be one thing, but not the multitude of things that we see as bodies. So this brings us to the notion, the physics of atoms. And according to Epicurus, atoms can join with each other, and by joining with each other, they form larger objects. There's a very important concept that is specific to the Epicureans, the concept of vibration. When atoms join together, they still maintain the ability to vibrate. Now, all these concepts are meant for one reason. The reason being to explain the world that we live in, right? That's why these concepts exist. And this notion of vibration is an interesting one, because basically what this explains is the problem of change. You know, people asked at the time, philosophers of the time asked, why do things change? If atoms are unchanging, if they're uncuttable and unchanging, and they have a very particular shape, size, and they can't come into existence and they can't disappear from existence, how do we account for change? Well, this idea of vibration is how you can account for change, because the vibrations allow objects to change, but at the same time, they can maintain their basic shape, right? So over time, things change, but they don't change radically. They change gradually. And they can still maintain their basic shape until eventually the atoms in every body disperse, and then the body is no longer the body that we know. The notion of vibration, of course, also can explain how the human body changes over time, but is yet the same body. It also explains the problem of aging, right? Why do we age? Well, it's the vibration of the atoms that causes us to age. Another very important concept in Epicurean physics is the notion of swerve. Okay, and this is a key idea. And one of the issues that Democritus encountered with the atomic theory was the problem of determinism. What happens to free will? If atoms are nothing but irreducible particles that are propelled in the void and are bound to strict cause and effect, and since we are made of atoms, how do we deal with the problem of free will? You know, how can we be free and still be made up of particles? If you are saying that everything is particles, including us, including our consciousness and our thoughts, everything, and these particles are bound by very strict cause and effect, how do you deal with the problem of freedom? So, you know, these strict causal principles that are tied to material objects were problematic. So Epicurus, the Epicureans, came up with a very, very, very important concept that they called swerve. And swerve basically is the idea that at times, randomly, atoms swerve out of their usual determined paths. It's random. You can't really find any causal reason for it. It just happens, and the reason why it happens is sort of unknown. It's not causally determined. By the way, I just want to point out that when I was reading this, I was thinking, well, this is very interesting, and it sounds very similar to the modern day quantum physics idea of indeterminism. It's not the same, clearly, but it does seem to have some kind of a relation, or it seems to, it sounds somewhat similar. Anyway, the swerving motion of atoms is what accounts for human free will. And if it wasn't for the atomic swerve, human beings would be completely determined and be at the mercy of a never-ending chain of cause and effect. And by the way, later, well, the Stoics, which was a competing school to the Epicureans, did argue that human beings are absolutely, unequivocally, and categorically causally determined. Okay, the Epicureans did not believe this, the Stoics did. So from all of this, it's clear that the Epicureans are basically materialistic. Epicureanism is a materialistic philosophy. And epistemologically, Epicureans are empiricists. Okay, they are hardcore empiricists. Everything is made up of either space or atoms and objects in space, which means that true knowledge can only come from sense perception, since the only thing that's real is what we can experience through our senses. The only knowledge that we can have can come only through our senses. Very importantly, the Epicureans were intent on completely getting rid of any kind of Platonic transcendence as a means to knowledge. They did not believe, could not account for, could not reason the Platonic notion, even the Aristotelian notion of forms. Okay, so incorporeal forms were anathema to the Epicureans. And even the Aristotelian form, the form that was in the body. So that's what Aristotle argued. Plato argued that forms were outside the body. Aristotle argued that the forms were in the body. None of that made any sense to the Epicureans. Any kind of form, any type of non-material reality or object was anathema to the Epicureans. And they argue that you can't accept them because they lead to all sorts of problems. For example, I mean, just very quickly, the Platonic form, the transcendent form, leads to the problem of corporeal and incorporeal interaction. The basic question is there, well, how can something corporeal, material, interact with something that is incorporeal, immaterial? How is that possible? Given that those two things are completely different, how is it possible for them to interact? And of course, Plato says that they do interact. Aristotle says that the immanent forms, the forms in the body, which are non-material, interact with the body. They propel the body. Well, how does that happen? How can an immaterial thing interact with a physical thing? And this is, by the way, also reminiscent of the arguments that were later brought to bear on Descartes, who argued mind-body dualism and argued that mind and body are completely different. Body is matter extended in space, said Descartes. Mind is something that thinks but is not extended. Well, that brought up the question of, well, how does mind, which is completely the opposite of matter, actually interact with matter? And it of course has to, because the mind is in our bodies. I mean, we are aware of our own minds. So that's one problem. The other problem is the problem of charismos, the problem of separation. How do the intelligible forms, this is the Platonic forms, interact with the sensually perceptible world, given that they are separated and completely different from one another? Plato says that the Platonic forms are like in this other realm, but they actually affect the things in this world. How is that possible? Not possible, say the Epicureans. So the only perception, the only thing that is true is sense perception. In fact, say the Epicureans, all sense perception is true. All sense perception. Sometimes sense perception does seem to deceive us. But, say the Epicureans, that's because we have made a mistake in how we judge sense perception. So all sense perceptions, say the Epicureans, are reasonable, and we sense what we see. There's no skepticism. We can't be skeptical. Okay, what we see is what is there. However, we have to bring to bear judgment. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example, okay, of what I'm talking about here. Since the Epicureans thought that sense perception could not deceive, they argued that all sense perception must start, that all truth must start with sense perception. But there are examples where sense perception seems to deceive. For example, how a straight oar looks bent in water. Now, the Epicureans argue that, well, actually, what happens there is that the atoms of the water probably shifted the image of the ore, and that we in fact do see it as bent. So we're not being deceived. That's how we see it. That's how it's represented to our senses. It's represented to our senses as bent. We're not being deceived at all by our senses. That's how we see it. Unlike Descartes, right, who says that we can be deceived by our senses. The Epicureans say, no, no, that's what we see, and that's what's actually there. So perception is not deceiving us. But the problem is that sometimes we err in assuming that the image correctly represents the ore. So we neglect to see that the image of the ore, as it hits our eyes, has shifted. Okay, so, you know, we haven't quite, at this point, brought good judgment to our sense perceptions. Here's another example that I often used with my students when I was teaching. So many of you are probably familiar with this example, but the question is, which of the two lines is longer? Which of the two lines is longer? Well, if you look at the two sort of examples there, clearly the line at the top seems longer than the line at the bottom, right? That's what our senses seem to be telling us. However, if you do this, we can see that they're actually exactly the same. So the question becomes, you know, are we being deceived by our senses? Well, Epicurus says, no, we're not being deceived at all, because what we don't have is a clear vision, what they called enargia. We don't have clear enargia of the perceived object. So in order to get clear vision, you have to examine objects of perception more closely. You have to bring close examination to things. So the notion of enargia, which is, by the way, it means vividness, clarity, detail. You need to bring clarity to what you experience, and vividness. And by the way, people who study literature and who write literature are very much into this idea of enargia, because it's through the details, through creating a vivid representation of something, that you get clarity. And this is very much what the Epicureans believe, that clarity comes through a vivid sort of understanding of what we perceive by close examination. And basically the goal is to see what is not seen, see the unseeable, okay? And that's what enargia takes you to. It enables you to see the unseeable. And by the way, this is not the scientific method, but it is, you know, certainly an old version of what I would say is kind of a scientific model.